I would go so far as to say that the concept of objectivity is the central guiding norm of epistemology. If the purpose of epistemology is guidance in the use of concepts, then the foundation and essence of all guidance is objectivity. Everything else in epistemology is the implementation. It tells you how to be objective. But the first law of thought is be objective.
Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. William, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. Well, that was Leonard Peikoff talking about objectivity and how important it is. So we thought we'd talk about it.
Right. The word objective has been used in, objectivist circles quite a lot. It's often used as an insult. Say, oh, you're not being objective. So we get smeared a lot with this term. So, and it's become actually kind of like a litmus test of whether you're an objectivist. They say, oh, you're not being objective. You're not a real objectivist. So we thought we'd explore this concept and dig into it a little bit. And Leonard Peikoff describes it as a vital concept, the central norm in epistemology, and I happen to agree with that. I think it's a critical concept to understand. And if you don't grasp the objectivist view of objectivity, it's going to be very difficult for you to apply the philosophy in your own life.
That's true, though, and this comes from Leonard's Peikoff's lecture on Rand's distinctive conception of objectivity from the course Objectivism, the State of the Art by Leonard Peikoff. And although I mean, obviously objectivity is crucial, there are some points that I see hints of rationalism and kind of intellectualizing objectivity that we're going to get into and discuss as well. But I thought it would be good to start with Rand's definition of objectivity.
Yeah, so Ayn Rand defined objectivity in her article, Who is the Final Authority in Ethics, from the Objectivist newsletter in February of 1965. You can also find the excerpt in the Ayn Rand lexicon, and I'll just read it from the lexicon. She says, objectivity is both a metaphysical and an epistemological concept. It pertains to the relationship of consciousness to existence. Metaphysically, it is the recognition of the fact that reality exists independent of any perceiver's consciousness. Epistemologically, it is the recognition of the fact that a perceiver's consciousness, man's consciousness, must acquire knowledge of reality by certain means, for example, reason, in accordance with certain rules, for example, logic. This means that although reality is immutable and in any given context, only one answer is true, the truth is not automatically available to a human consciousness and can be obtained only by a certain mental process, which is required of every man who seeks knowledge. That there is no substitute for this process, no escape from the responsibility for it, no shortcuts, no special revelations to privileged observers, and that there can be no such thing as a final authority in matters pertaining to human knowledge. Metaphysically, the only authority is reality. Epistemologically, one's own mind. The first is the ultimate arbiter of the second. End quote. So there's quite a lot there to digest. It is a complex, very advanced concept, one that most people don't even fully grasp until they're adults. So
Yeah,
I think from there we can go on to like what Leonard Peikoff, how he described it.
Absolutely, and we will. I just wanted to just bring up a couple of other overview points first. That, one thing they talk about, because the way she's describing it, it's the relationship of, an individual with reality, which I think is a kind of even good layman's definition. I do think, I went to Chat GPT. To be objective, it says, means to approach things based on facts, logic, and reality rather than personal feelings, biases, or subjective interpretations. It involves evaluating evidence independently of personal preferences or emotions. And, I think Rand would take issue with that. I I understand that as a general approach, but we have to differentiate objective from what she called being disinterested, the way she derisively described the media in Atlas Shrugged, where it's just like, I'm not a person, I don't have a stake in this. And part of objectivity, I think, is realizing that you do have a stake in it. So the idea that your emotions wouldn't be involved, it's, can you make, within having emotions, can you still say, hey, I still want to know the truth?
Exactly. So one of the main points Leonard Peikoff will elaborate on, and which Ayn Rand makes clear, is that this process of objectivity is a human process. She talks about human knowledge. So the process has to be particular to a human being and how a human cognition works, how a human figures things out about reality. And part of that process is the fact that we have feelings and emotions and internal workings in our mind and how our mind works. So part of the process of figuring out knowledge is recognizing that feelings aren't going to make it true, and wishing won't make it so. But you have to also take into consideration things like introspection, like we're aware of our own mind, our own mental feelings and thoughts and imaginations and dreams. So you have to be able to recognize what's true to your mind only and not true about the external reality or physical reality.
Yeah. And you can take things like your context into account, like, if you lived in the during the Inquisition and you had to pretend you were religious or something, but in your own head what you believe, and that you're still trying to find out the truth. That to me is objectivity. But and we'll explore this further on. But yeah, to your point of getting into what Peikoff said, again, this is from the course Objectivism, State of the Art. And early on, Peikoff says that the concept objective arises to describe the status of concepts.
In other words, the concept objective arises to begin with as a description of the status of concepts. It arises as a description of concepts. The word objective begins, the first root of it is, it stands for the fact that concepts are formed a certain way. That is the base of objectivity. If you took the concept objectivity and said, trace it back to its roots in reality, the reality that you would have to trace it back to, the rock bottom would be what our minds do in forming a concept. That would be the root from which objectivity arises. And as you'll see, you cannot have a concept of objectivity if you hold an improper theory of concepts. And this is why the revolution of Ayn Rand's epistemology is the theory of concepts, because that's what made possible objectivity and therefore her whole approach to cognition and rationality.
He makes an interesting claim that you can't have a concept of objectivity until you have a theory, until you've developed a theory of what it means to create concepts and form knowledge and be objective.
Exactly. Objectivity existed before Rand's theory of concepts.
Objectivity as the process of gaining knowledge, but not necessarily as a full-blown concept. I think maybe what's happening is you have a primitive form of the concept of objectivity, which isn't the mature form. Like even a baby or maybe a child who's has a few concepts already and starts applying that knowledge, he can kind of grasp the idea that he needs to open his eyes in order to gain knowledge of the outside world, but he doesn't have the concept of objectivity. You know, an adult would understand that in order to see the outside world and for perception to take place, he needs to open his eyes and listen through his ears and things like that, use his senses. But a baby will just sort of naturally do that, you know, because it understands nothing's happening, so let me open my eyes. You know, there's something to that effect. So there's this primitive form of the understanding, and then there's a full-blown philosophical concept which a mature person uses. And this relates to
Not just
other.
a mature person, someone who explicitly understands Rand's theory of concepts.
Yeah, I mean that's taking it to an even greater step.
But
But I think
I think she said there's to be no final arbiter, but I mean, this kind of setup, you can see how it would kind of potentially lead to a priesthood that, oh, the people at ARI are the ones that can tell us when we've become fully objective.
yeah, well, I mean, even Ayn Rand thought she had the correct philosophy. So if you think that you're in possession of the ultimate philosophy, then you're going to think that you have a greater knowledge than other people. But I wanted to get back to another point. I think this relates to Rand's idea of the hierarchy of knowledge. Just in general, when you form concepts, you're going to begin with less data, less units of the concept than you would have as a mature adult because you gain knowledge over time, over your lifetime. So when you're a little child and you see a ball, you might only have a few examples of a ball. So you have like a tennis ball lying around or a golf ball, and then, but your concept is still ball. You still have this primitive form of a ball. Concept of a ball is a round toy to play with, you know. And then when you grow up and you become an adult, you got, you know, bunch of examples of balls, soccer ball,
But
football, and
that's
you know there's
making objectivity like levels of knowledge.
well, in some cases it is your level of knowledge because as long as you're within the context of your knowledge, you should be okay. You're not going to fantasize about weird balls that don't exist. You're just going to stick with the ones you understand and know. And so,
But
but then as you learn about different types of balls and shapes and colors and textures, you're going to have a more advanced idea of what a ball is. And in the
right, but I
same
mean, the
case, you're going
idea is that someone like a physicist or whatever applied mathematician could use that knowledge of roundness or whatever else they discover and apply it in some way. And in that same way, I think objectivity has to be applied to the real world and just out of the mind. Elon
yeah,
Musk is an example of being ultra objective, where he figures out what needs to be done and then he just builds the thing.
yeah. But what I'm saying is to your point that even like a primitive person would have a concept of objectivity. I think he would have a concept, but it would be a primitive form of it because he doesn't have sophisticated rules of logic until Aristotle comes around. He doesn't understand the fallacies, but he understands he needs to open his eyes and listen and smell things and use his senses.
Right. But that
That's
wanting
primitive.
to know the truth is more applied objectivity than, having a theory of concepts per se,
Yes,
and the
it's
right theory of
so
concepts.
I think so it's going to be a proper method, and a proper method begins with observation and using your senses, and so that's the start of it. And once if you as long as you grasp that and you can recognize the difference between a rock in a lying on the grass and you and your thinking, then you understand objectivity because you understand that there's something outside of your consciousness and your consciousness is being used to grasp that. So there can be a primitive form of objectivity, but it probably wouldn't be called objectivity. You wouldn't name the concept objectivity. It would just be thinking. This is how I think.
But why not use the just go back to the standard definition of, why use objective to mean like a deeper level of knowledge when, there are other terms for that. But I want to go back to what you said about method, because Peikoff reiterates throughout this about the importance of method.
So when we say a human method, I don't mean simply a method employed by man. I mean more specifically than that, a method whose nature flows from the needs and nature of human consciousness. If you don't understand that, you're going to slip into the intrinsicist view that all we do is open our mind and look out. But having stressed that it is a human method by which we form concepts, we must immediately say that if you employ this method properly, it conforms at every step to facts. Otherwise, it would be irrelevant to cognition. And if we get this duality, you'll see you can't project the products of this method outward into reality apart from us, because that would ignore the fact that it's our creation in a real way. But you can't take the products of this method and detach them from reality either, because then you've wiped out the whole cognitive role of it.
I'm all for method. I'm all for being reality based. People are using a method when they're being objective, but they don't have to be aware that they're using a method necessarily.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that goes back to, like primitive men who didn't necessarily understand logic, but they did understand that they were seeing things and they were using their eyes to look around, and thoughts were going through their head and they were chewing on ideas. So like making tools, like I think people who made the first tools out of stone or whatever, they had to have some ideas going through their head. They had to have some sort of cognitive method. And in order to do that, they had to apply some objective method of relating to reality.
Even trial and error and figuring out, that, if they have a little cut to them, they're sharper.
Yeah, and trial and error, they would learn, and then they would pass on that knowledge through storytelling, because they didn't have writing. So I think once humans invented books and writing, they were able to pass on their knowledge in a more complete and sophisticated and permanent manner. And then just human technology took off. But before that, I think you're right. Is you can have this method. It's a natural way of functioning. So in a sense, it's just how your mind works. And as long as there's no corrupting influence, some sort of subjectivist or intrinsicist teaching in schools, your objective method will just naturally take over and form, and you will learn how to use your mind. And that is the objective method. That's objectivity.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't have to be a complex, sophisticated understanding in like a philosophical work, written down in some epistemological text. It can just be passed on through word of mouth. This is how you come to understand this thing about reality. This is how you do it.
Right. Those cavemen were still being objective when they wanted something sharper, and they were looking for the truth of it.
They show their child, here's a rock, here's another rock. You bang these two rocks together, and you get a blade. You get a sharp knife.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be as simple as that.
Yeah. Well, in this next clip, Peikoff summarizes his definition of objectivity using method.
To be objective is volitionally to adhere to reality by following certain rules of method a method appropriate to man's form of cognition and based on facts. Now, you know there are many uses of the term objective, and sometimes we talk about objective reality, and that's harmless, that's okay. And in that kind of usage, objective merely means independent of consciousness. But that is not the significant meaning of the concept. Objective is a concept not out of metaphysics, but out of epistemology. Strictly speaking, existents aren't objective, they simply are. It's mind, and specifically conceptual processes, that are objective or non-objective.
Well, I tend to agree with him here. I think it's much more important to study the epistemological concept of objectivity. I think the metaphysical concept should just be obvious to everybody. It's pretty much necessary for you to understand that a rock is separate from your mind in order for you to function. And this is why I think there aren't many actual intrinsicists or actual subjectivists who apply those ideas in reality, because if they applied them in reality, they would just die. They wouldn't be able to survive. So in practice, I think most people just naturally are objective. But in terms of objectivist studying,
not by his definition. It needs to be much more explicit.
Yeah, but I mean, there are examples of mass death, in history. So I think there are examples where they took it too far and just brought down their civilizations. But in general today, you don't have a whole lot of it where people are just idiots and can't be objective in practice. They lie to themselves when it comes to philosophy, and they say, "Oh, I'm really a subjectivist, or I'm really an intrinsicist, or whatever." But they don't really act that way very much in reality. And if they do, they harm themselves. But getting back to objectivist studying this concept, I think it's critical that you focus on the epistemological concept, because it does relate to how you view the world and your method. And the method of gaining that knowledge is much more important, in my view, because that will lead you to a better grasp of the metaphysical view. You just need to understand how your mind operates in relation to the outside world.
But I mean, I like his definition of, making a choice to use facts and trying to figure things out, if I'm summarizing him. But he talks about existence, NTS, and aren't human beings also an existent? He puts everything in the mind and conceptual processes, but it's that interacting with reality and not emphasizing that part, I think, is part of the rationalism in the movement.
Well, this probably is a big source of rationalism. I mean, not understanding the relationship between existence and consciousness. I know you talk about existence, TENTS.
Right.
So it's important to understand what is an existent, and is your mind an existent? And I looked this up, and Rand was very careful in the introduction to objectivist epistemology workshops, like at the end of the book. She was careful to answer a question about this. She was asked by Professor A, does existence implicitly include consciousness as part of existence? And she says, here I was very careful in my formulation in Atlas Shrugged. Quote, the act of grasping that statement, unquote, implies consciousness. Existence exists whether there is any consciousness or not. But since you are making that claim, in the act of grasping it, you are introducing the axiom of consciousness. She also goes on in that dialogue to say that the axiom existence exists is wider than the concept of the external world. It includes everything, as I indicated, including your mental states, mental processes, and such phenomena as ideas or feelings, which are not in the same category as physical reality, but they exist. So she was asked about it. It is a complex concept which she had to explain in the workshops to even these professors who were professors of philosophy. So they didn't quite grasp it, and she fully fleshed it out for them. Yes, existence includes your mind and its products. So an existent includes ideas and it includes feelings, but they are of the type of they're a type of attribute of a human. So the mind is an attribute of the human, so it's a product of the human. So the human is the physical entity, but a human happens to have a mind. So a human is a complex organism, living organism that has a mental component. So it's important, if I can, just to elaborate on the distinction being made here between existence and consciousness, because often Ayn Rand will say things like consciousness versus existence or consciousness versus reality. And I think those are she's using those as like shorthand terms. And you have to dig deeper to really understand what she means. She really means the distinction between the mental and the physical, or the conscious and the non-conscious, like physical reality. So it's a little difficult to grasp that, but in order to grasp that, you have to understand that your consciousness is part of reality.
Yeah, exactly. The consciousness is within reality. That's the primacy of existence. But I also like how he says that the metaphysical definition is harmless. Like he's like, that's okay. He's like, it's like he's granting permission for people to use that terminology.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, what is objective reality? If you're using a modifier for reality, then it kind of means that everything in reality is like an object. And I think so this is an issue I have with the metaphysics in objectivism. I don't think Rand fully grasped the nature of space. So I think space is important, and to compare it to matter or physical reality. But that's another topic for another day, probably.
Yeah, you're opening a can of worms there.
I think that objective reality to people in the objectivist movement simply means that, what Rand was saying earlier, that things are outside of you, and no matter wishing can make it differently. You can't just wish away a rock because it's not part of your imagination. It's a real thing out there, and it will still exist when you die.
And objectivity is always you interacting with the world. It's not just all in your mind.
Yeah, but that's part of the epistemological relationship, right? Because it's how you gain knowledge about reality. So the reality is not in your mind, it's out there, and you have to observe it through your sensations, and then process it perceptually and think about it and reason and figure out, is what you're seeing out there actually out there, or is it a hallucination? Or what's going on? And that's part of reason and logic and science.
Yeah. But in
Yeah.
this next clip, kind of along those lines, Peikoff says that you aren't objective until it's explicit.
That you just open your eyes at 3 months old and you get reality and causality and so on. You do not get objectivity this way. It has to be found, and it has to be found explicitly. Until it's found, we are in very bad shape. Now this, let us call this the methodical commitment to reality, meaning by that a method that we have named and are following in an attempt to adhere to reality.
I think what he's doing here is kind of describing objectivity as the mature philosophical concept. And in that sense, there's some truth there, is that you don't have a fully committed relationship to understanding reality, or fully methodical commitment, until you have this mature concept. But like we were
But
saying
what is
earlier,
fully? I feel like, it's almost utopian. There's not this one thing where we just finally fully know reality. There's ways that we're just getting more at it. And that, there are business people that have internalized objectivity and what they're building, but they may not be able to express it explicitly.
yeah, I guess it's unclear to what extent you have to be able to describe it to yourself or commit to it. Uh,
Yeah.
I think there's also different levels of the mature concept. So you can have an understanding that objectivity requires you to not rely on your feelings and go for, logic and evidence, rely on evidence and facts and this sort of thing. But then there's also like a much more advanced levels where you know the fallacies inside and out, you know all the evidence possible because you've studied this for 10 years or whatever.
But you can
There's
be an objectivist philosopher studying it for 10 years and still, have problems with objectivity in your day-to-day life.
sure. I mean, if you are studying the wrong information, you mistake, you
Or
know, lies for facts, then you're going to have a problem. Also, if you don't fully grasp the fallacies, you don't understand if you're making a fallacy or not. Um, you know, that's the sort of thing that, you can build your knowledge, where you can build your knowledge and become better and more precise and more objective. So I think such a thing as being less objective and more objective, but that doesn't mean that just because you're less objective, you're subjective. Like there's a subjective part of you. It just means that you don't have all the tools to make a huge, a huge conclusion.
right.
But if
That goes back to when you said earlier about people using "you're not objective" as an insult. Just a way of saying, I'm better than you.
this relates to the private um, disputes that objectivists have been having. And so, like some objectivists will say, if you don't know all the private details that went on, then you can't be objective. Well, yeah, you can, but you have to remain within your context of knowledge, and
Exactly.
you can't make some sweeping assumption based on fantasies. If you stick to the facts that you know about the private conversation or private dispute, then you can make some objective assessment, but your conclusion won't be as profound as someone who knows everything.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even objectivity is contextual within what you know and what you can know.
Everything's contextual because we're humans.
Right. Well, continuing along this line, Peikoff further seems to say that only an advocate of objectivity can grasp the relationship between the axioms.
You see, the axioms of philosophy can't be torn apart. And here I'm referring to existence and consciousness. There's no consciousness without existence, and no knowledge of existence without consciousness. And only the advocate of objectivity grasps this. Only he recognizes that a volitional relationship between consciousness and existence is the essence of knowledge. And therefore, he's the only one that can champion the primacy of existence. That's in the grasp, you see. And at the same time, the efficacy of human consciousness, because that grasp is to be attained by active, volitionally generated processes. And the practical result of this approach, so far as Aristotle made it possible at all, was the Renaissance, and let us hope another Renaissance sometime in the future.
So I agree with him in general that you can't really be objective unless you understand the proper relationship between consciousness and existence. One of the problems is that this is a very difficult idea to grasp. It shouldn't be, But because we have our natural way of learning things as a human being, but the problem is there's a lot of corruption in education. And so people get corrupted at an early age and their mind just gets warped and they're not led down the proper path of thinking. And also, even in objectivism, one of the problems is that I think Ayn Rand made some wording mistakes. Like she could have worded her epistemological statements better. And she could have made a stronger distinction between like the mental and the physical, and explained better what she meant between consciousness and existence. Because consciousness, as she stated in the workshops in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, consciousness is part of existence. And so it's how do you think about the relationship between consciousness and existence if part of that relationship has to include the fact that consciousness is part of existence? It is an existence.
Yeah, I mean that was some of Kant's basis for rejecting certainty, because our to see is to distort and stuff like that. To me, I don't understand the special credence to advocates. I mean, the term advocate historically means someone not necessarily objective, but pushing for a certain viewpoint. And I understand it's advocates for, the primacy of existence and reality. I don't, it's almost like they say that the only people that can take Social Security are the ones that have said they're against it. It does, you don't want to have this situation where you just have people repeating slogans as a sign of their virtue. Like, I'm an advocate, only I can be objective.
Yeah, and this is probably relating to what you were saying about rationalism earlier.
Right.
If people are simply advocating objectivity, then that doesn't necessarily mean they're being objective or they have an actual understanding or grasp of objectivity. They could just be a rationalist, repeating what they've heard, and they're using this idea as some sort of ideal, like just an idea in their head, and they're not actually a practitioner of objectivity. They don't actually do it in reality. They don't actually practice objectivity. So I think it's more important to look at people who are achieving real results and discovering real things. And they probably have the process of objectivity down better than someone who's merely advocating it and yet making mistakes left and right.
Right. Or just not being objective in their day-to-day lives, or, their political views or whatever. And they've determined anyone that disagrees with them is an objective. But we'll save that one. In this next clip, Peikoff says that objectivity is more than honesty.
Objectivity is not the same as honesty. It is more than honesty. Now, the clearest example of this would be a savage or a young child who is, let us say, 100% honest by his lights. He's not evading. He's really trying, let us say, to understand something or other. That by itself does not make him objective. Objectivity means a definite, what's the word I'm looking for? Method. A deliberate, systematic attempt to correspond to reality by a defined procedure. And prior to the Greeks, mankind had no knowledge yet of method, and therefore was cut off from objectivity as such. I qualify that only to this extent. Some elements of a proper method were somewhat, although not clearly known, by some earlier cultures, without a broader context. They weren't formulated, they couldn't be applied properly and fully. So they did not really make the knowledge at the time objective, but they were like the first gropings.
Well, again, he's defining objectivity as this advanced method and something that you couldn't possibly have until the Greeks. Um, and if that's the way he's defining it, then sure. Obviously, civilization didn't start taking off until the Greeks. And
But I
they,
mean, there were civilizations before. They built the pyramids before. I mean, the Sumerian cities as well. So, for irrigation, I mean, it requires objectivity and trying things out and wanting to find the truth. And I just, I don't agree with the view that the child trying to learn isn't being objective.
well, on that point, I agree because even a child has the natural functioning of reason, of developing a process of reason. And that is learning is part of being objective. You can't divorce the way you become objective from being objective. You have to be objective at some level in order to form this advanced idea of objectivity.
That's
Because
true.
what it refers to in reality is your method of understanding the world.
Right.
Your
And
human
understanding it intellectually like that is an intellectual achievement, but it's not necessarily superior to the level of objectivity of an Elon Musk that may not be able to put it explicitly like that verbally, but he does in his creations.
Yeah, and again, this is I think they could have, or Leonard Peikoff could have described it better. Um,
Yeah.
I think what happens is you look at the fully formed concept and you think, oh, well, that's what it is. That's all it is. And unless you have this fully formed concept, you don't have the concept. But it's only true that you don't have that fully formed version of it. You can begin with a lesser formed version of it. Um, but you said something about Elon Musk. Um,
Being objective with his
you-
creations.
yeah, so I think you can have the Elon Musks who understand science and reason at a genius level, or an Ayn Rand, and then you have just some general, like, common man worker in a factory who still has objectivity, but he's not a genius. He only understands the method at a lower level enough for him to get by and survive. And this goes also to what Leonard was saying about the bunglers before the Greeks. And you were mentioning other civilizations before the Greeks who built things and understood
Right.
things.
I
And
mean, you can call it first gropings, but it's relative. People may call the pre-AI era the first gropings one day.
yeah, and I think groping is not the best term for it. It's it's an immature version. So it's you think of the human growth and knowledge like you think of just a human being growing up. You have a baby, you have a child, an adolescent, young adult, elderly person. They go through these stages. And just like a human goes through stages, civilization will go through stages. And you'll have the first civilizations won't have as much knowledge as the later civilizations. So, but the first civilizations still have a method of
Right.
objectivity. They they have
Exactly.
they have to have a method because that is what the brain does. That's what our human mind does.
They
Is it
might have even had it explicitly and just didn't write it down, or the writings didn't survive.
Yeah, it could have been a mix. I'm sure it was a mixture because they had all
Yeah.
these fantasies. They thought trees had gods in them or whatever. So
I know.
they applied their own idea of what an object was, a human being with a mind. They applied that to the outside world and thought everything had a mind and, gods were in the sky
I
with
just
the
think he's giving these Greek philosophers too much, credit for, like, objectivity didn't exist before them. He's associating objectivity too much with philosophy and the world of ideas when the real meaning matters in our day-to-day lives.
Just the facts matter. Like what does, so even these primitive people who had, very mystical ideas of the world, were they completely and totally acting on that? Some of them did, and they killed themselves, sacrificed virgins and everything to these gods. But some didn't. Some just went on with their life and just sort of burnt, animals as a sacrifice. And that was pretty harmless. And so, as long as their rituals to the fantasies were relatively harmless, they could survive using their objective method. So they would just go about their daily lives farming and making things and building roads and houses, and to do that they had to have some sort of objective method. So they had a mixture of beliefs and methods, but as long as their crazy method didn't take over, they could maintain their civilization.
Yeah, it we just don't know what we don't know about those civilizations. I assume he would leave himself open if new evidence came out. But in this last clip, Peikoff claims that subjectivism isn't part of early civilizations, but it comes more when a culture is rotting.
You have really got only the choice of the subjective or the intrinsic. Subjectivism is too corrupt for primitive people. Subjectivism as a dominant cultural thing waits for the rot of a civilization. That's the nihilist element. Let's say down with reality, but never occurred to a savage to be so depraved as to say to hell with reality. So he falls naturally into the idea he wants to obey, but he has no method, and so he waits for reality to tell him just as other people tell him. From that point of view, I have exhibited now a little bias in favor of the intrinsicist approach than the subjectivist, but that's only because these people lived thousands of years ago and were utterly helpless. Today, the Pope does not get that bias. The Greeks were the first method-conscious culture in history, and therefore objectivity began with them, and of course specifically with Aristotle.
I tend to agree with Leonard there. I do have a bias towards intrinsicism as the more natural mistake primitives would make. I think subjectivism, as the crude concept of believing your mind invents reality, or your mind creates reality, that's just too absurd for any primitive to accept. A primitive isn't going to be corrupted by these sophisticated academic theories we have now. The primitive is just going to.
I see subjectivism more as whim worship, which still existed in early cultures.
Yeah, I think there's examples of like a subjective type, but it's not like full-blown subjectivism. Like in primitive cultures, you'd have the prophets who maybe they had a dream, like a vivid dream, and they mistook it for reality. And so they think, well, this must be a sign of the future to come or something like that. But then when the prophets, their dreams don't come true, what do? They have to either reinvent the prophecy or admit that they were wrong. And so I think that in most cases, the prophets didn't come up with anything really grand or great or something, and that's why they were relegated to these temples, and they had to rely on people to give them food and things. And they were kind of admired as like idea makers or maybe strategists, but I don't think anyone fully accepted them as seeing the future, because they were wrong so often. So
yeah, they just say, oh, it gets blurry sometimes or something intervened. They've had psychics throughout time, but
well, their prophecies have to be so vague to be meaningless in order for them to later claim that they came true. Like, oh, a son will be born or something,
right.
on the third day of March. It's like, okay, well, there's going to be people born on the third day of March, and then you can make things up as it goes. But if you're trying to be a prophet and you had like this vivid, lucid dream about something, and you honestly describe it and say this is going to come true, well, that's not going to come true. It's going to be ridiculous. And so I think they eventually prophets, we don't have many prophets anymore, I guess, because they just died out. Nobody takes
Yaron
them
tells us
seriously.
he can, he gets a lot of stuff right.
Yeah,
Um,
we call him a
but
prophet. We call him a prophet in jest, but really he's
yeah,
just trying to like predict. He's saying, "Oh, I think this is going to come true."
right. But I want to go back to what he said, that subjectivism isn't part of an early culture, but more when it's rotting. It's like, how is he measuring this? Is he talking about all of Western civilization over 2,000 years? And like with Kant, it started to go wrong? Because, I mean, that was also like the tail end of the Enlightenment. And
Yeah, I don't know. It probably begins with some German, who's like just so doesn't enjoy his life. Like he lives in such a hellhole that he's inventing this world in his own mind, and
I,
that's
I,
he's living the reality in his own mind.
I guess. I couldn't help but when he said he had a bias towards intrinsicism, with the Kelly schism, Peikoff called Kelly a subjectivist, and Kelly calls Peikoff an intrinsicist.
Yeah, I think intrinsicism is the more natural mistake. So if you don't understand the conceptual formation, how it works, like epistemology and all that, and you're wondering like, where do my ideas come from? Which is a classic Norm Macdonald bit. It's like he's always asking his guests on his talk show, where do you get your ideas? As a joke. But I think if you're stuck on that question, then the natural inclination is to think that they're out in the world and you just absorb them, like you have an epiphany, and your epiphanies come from ideas that are intrinsic in the object you're looking at, um, something like that, or like a Platonic thing where they come from some other realm, and you're having this revelation. You're sensing the other realm and getting ideas from that realm. That's kind of like what is like a natural mistake to make, because you don't understand where these ideas come from. And so subconsciously, you're just going to sort of start spouting intrinsicist ideas about it. You may not even realize you're doing that because you're a rationalist,
Well,
and you're just so absorbed in your own thinking
you
that you
tell me if you think this is related. Uh, Peikoff did an interview with ARI's newsletter in February 1993. He was asked, "What do you like and dislike about being the spokesman of objectivism?" And he said, "I like having the power to make definitive statements on philosophic questions. I'm in a position to judge whether a particular view is essential to objectivism, a betrayal of it, or purely optional, and then to make my own view emphatically known." Is that
well,
a
first
hint
of
of
all,
intrinsicism?
well, first of all, everybody has that power. It's not exclusive to him. Everyone can say, "This is what I think objectivism is, and how you should understand it." You don't
That's
have to
true, but he
be.
knows his sway. I mean, come on, he did get McCaskey kicked off the board.
Yeah, what he's saying is, I more people will listen to me when I spout these pronouncements because I'm Ayn Rand's heir.
Mm-hmm.
And so he has this status. Um, so that wouldn't be the first thing that comes to my mind. I would I wouldn't answer it that way, but I think he's making a mistake there. Obviously, it's it is a sort of subjectivist. It's almost subjectivism. It
Yeah,
sounds like,
there are
but
because I mean, in the intrinsicist of a power hungry madman that just wants everyone to follow him blindly still ends up with some subjectivism of, and now I want to do whatever I feel like.
yeah, but it also could just be him taking pride in his work. He's studied this philosophy under Ayn Rand for years and years and years. He thinks he understands it perfectly, or at least near perfectly, or at least he has the best understanding of it of anyone. And so he takes pride in that. And
Sure.
in that context, I don't blame him for speaking the way he does. I just think that he should just be able to articulate it better.
Yeah, we all should. And I mean, I think that's part of advocacy. So you got to be an advocate. So, I mean, if you're not speaking it well enough, maybe you're not objective enough.
Also, I look at the historical context. Like, he was the first heir to Ayn Rand. So he had to come up with what it meant, what his feelings were on it. And we can look back on him, several decades later and criticize the way he articulated it. But maybe he just didn't have all the information, all the facts that we have now, to understand it the way we understand. So he was the only one trying to figure this out back then.
Yeah, no, you're taking a very benevolent attitude. Hopefully he would reciprocate with you. And I do want to switch gears a little bit here, because Yaron Brook was actually asked about objectivity a few years ago, and he explained it pretty well, even admitting he hasn't really fully integrated the concept.
It's you engaging your mind to discover reality. That's how you get knowledge. That's how you get knowledge about the world. And that's what objective knowledge is. All right, let's see. Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky that I just read all those chapters in Opa, and I still don't completely have it integrated. It's the epistemology, sections of the epistemology are hard. I get certain things. I get concept formation. I think I really understand concept formation, but objective, I can say it. But I can't say that it's fully integrated. It's hard. It's hard.
Well, it shouldn't be too hard. I mean, for someone who studied it for decades. He begins with, in my view, a very primitive view of objectivity, just saying it's how you engage your mind to understand the world. I mean, that's very...
But I probably lean towards more that definition than Peikoff's.
Well, Ayn Rand began with it as a relationship. I mean, I don't even know if Yaron understands it as a relationship, but he kind of describes it. He's saying it's how your mind engages. But that's not. He's not very good at picking the right words. It's like, how does your mind engage with reality? Objectivity is really about a relationship between your mind and existence, and then you recognizing a fact about that, which is that reality exists independent from your mind. So I mean, also he talks about not fully integrating the concept of objectivity.
Right.
That's I also have an issue with that, because I think that, again, it's contextual. So what does fully mean?
Right. That's what we...
And also, if he recognizes that he hasn't fully integrated with certain topics, maybe there's certain subjects where he's not clear on the objective method of approaching it or understanding it, well, then why isn't he immediately engrossed in studying that topic? Like, he's had plenty of time. Like, how long has he known about this partial integration?
Peikoff said it's a vital concept.
Yeah, and how long is he going to linger in this ignorance? There's been times in my life where I've realized, oh, I don't understand this, and this is an important topic. And so I just immediately read books about it or engross myself in studying it, go to the library, watch videos. I pour through my Rand books and see if she had anything to say about it. I don't just linger in my ignorance. If I find something that I think I need to apply a better method to and to understand it, then I get right on it. I don't want to be ignorant about whether to vote for Trump or Harris.
Yeah.
So, but some people aren't like that. Some people, they've grown old, they're tired, they don't want to study anymore. And so they don't take the steps necessary to gain the knowledge necessary to get to the truth. And I think that's sad. I think that, those types of people shouldn't be leading a movement.
He's teaching classes at OAC. I mean, I guess if he was being fully objective, he needs to enroll in a couple
or retake them. I mean, he's a graduate of the OAC, I believe, and so if he doesn't understand something, why doesn't he go back and study it?
There you go. I actually appreciate him admitting that he hasn't fully integrated it, and just that kind of candor on one level. But maybe he should consider that when he's telling people what hoops they have to jump through for him to consider them objective.
A real recognition that, that Trump's a bully and Trump's a weak bully, and that Trump is somehow in Russia's pocket. I mean, that would at least tell me that you're being objective.
Yeah, this is funny because he's trying to tell you how to be objective about Trump, yet he hasn't fully integrated the concept.
Is he fully objective when it comes to Trump? I mean, I don't even think his allies believe that. You have to accept that not only is Trump a bully, but he's a weak bully, and that he's a Russian spy. You have to accept the 2016 talking points of the Democrats for your own to consider you objective.
Being in bed with Russia is the big one, right? Like, how is that an objective assessment? What? Because first of all, he's using a metaphor in bed. That's what he said, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's used the metaphor in bed. I mean, I don't. He said it so many times. I don't know if he said it in that clip or not.
He said earlier in the show he had a feeling that Trump was being blackmailed by Russia.
Yeah. So in many different ways, he tries to say that Trump is a supporter of Russia. He's like a spy, or he's in bed with Russia. He's working for Russia. Well, come on. I mean, you need to provide a lot more evidence of that before you can say that's an objective conclusion. That's ridiculous. And he's trying to say, if you don't accept that, then you're not objective. Well, hell, man, there are millions and millions and millions of people that disagree with him. There's all sorts of evidence that disagrees with him. He's clearly off his rocker if that's his litmus test for whether you're objective. Also, I want to say something else real quick about this whole disclaimer culture I've been talking about. So people like Yaron will say, if you don't begin with disclaiming things about Trump, then you can't go on to say you support him. So you have to begin with all the negatives. Like, I don't like this about Trump. I don't like that. But I do like him here. I do like what he's doing here. And then Yaron will take you seriously, right?
Right. I mean, he's really misusing the power that Peikoff talked about earlier, that being the head of the movement makes him want to pronounce what objective means, in a way that's really more in line with his personal views.
Right. He can't just give you the benefit of the doubt that you disagree with some of the things Trump does. But you're not going to harp on them every time you talk about Trump, because speech making is about persuading people, and you want to make a point. So if you want to make a point that Trump, in this instance, Trump is doing something good, well, you're not going to begin with a litany of everything you disagree about him. So if this is Yaron's position that you need to disclaim Trump before you agree with him, he needs to disclaim himself. Like, he needs to say, I don't fully integrate objectivity in my life, but this is what I think about objectivity. It's like he needs, I like objectivity, but I don't fully integrate it. He needs to constantly be disclaiming himself.
I mean, finally, Yaron is going to tell us how to be objective when it comes to Trump.
Yeah, like I know everything there is to know about being objective about Trump, but I don't fully integrate objectivity in my life.
Yeah, I see this. You're right, and there are other examples of people using that in the movement of saying you're not objective if you disagree with me on this point, and that's how it's misused, and it's not objective.
Yeah, and that goes back to what we were saying earlier about it being used as a smear or an attack on your person, your level of intelligence. Maybe he uses objective as a smear so much because he doesn't understand it. He doesn't. To him, it's just a way of separating someone he doesn't like. And it's like, oh, you're not objective. You're not. You're ridiculous. Or what's the word he uses? You're
Pathetic. Be
Yeah,
that as it may, I think
ridiculous.
we talked about some really good stuff. I think we made our case for objectivity compared to in a little bit different from the leaders of the movement. Any final thoughts?
I think we covered so much. Maybe I'll
We
just
could have done more.
just want to emphasize like what we were talking about before, where objectivity is a concept that refers to something in reality. And it refers to this relationship you have between your mind and reality, and then your recognition of the proper method or process of figuring things out, learning, understanding reality. So your mind, you have this natural process of cognition, and it develops over time, and through evolution, even through evolution, humans have developed their mind and their thinking power and their method of figuring things out. We probably didn't always have this ability to retain so much in our memory. Like they talk about the crow epistemology. Well, I think that maybe primitive humans couldn't retain like 7 units or 7 to 11 units or whatever. They could only retain maybe 4 or 5 units.
Yeah, it probably increases a little each generation and within families.
Yeah, so as your brain evolves and your mind develops throughout history, you're going to have to change your method because you become a different type of human being. You become more advanced. And so as humans develop, they're going to have a more developed method of cognition and objectivity. And that's an important, I think, critical fact to grasp. And so then once you grasp that, you're going to understand that primitive man had some sort of method of objectivity, but it wasn't ours. It wasn't as advanced. And so then you understand that you can be an objective primitive person, but you're going to make mistakes. You're going to make more mistakes because you don't have all the knowledge. You don't have all the facts. But I'm sure there were very smart primitive men and women who were able to focus, outward and focus on reality and weren't obsessed by all the junk going on in their imagination. But they were able to figure out what in their mind they could create in reality, like tools. And so that's how you get tool making. And from there, once you understand that your mind can be used to then create a blueprint for things to make in reality, well, there you go. There's creativity, there's innovation, and then civilization takes off. And that's all part of objectivity.
Great. Good wrap up. Who knows, maybe we'll do an objectivity part 2. But for now, I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. This is the Ayn Rand Fan Club, and we will see you next time.